It is curious how silence, when it settles over a building of learning, does not feel like absence, but accumulation. That evening, the silence in St. Swathin's Hall seemed to thicken around me, gathering the remnants of conversation, the clatter of knives and the smoke of extinguished candles. The air had that weary scent peculiar to old dining halls, wax, wine, and something faintly ecclesiastical, as if every supper were a rehearsal for a confession. I had lingered, as I often did. The others had drifted away toward their cars or their cigarettes, leaving behind a constellation of half-drained glasses and forgotten scarves. I have never been good at departures. There is a certain decency in being last to leave, as though one were tidying away the memory of a gathering rather than the plates themselves. The hall's oak panels glowed faintly under the dim sconces. A steward moved at the far end, methodically removing the silver. His steps, muffled by age and repetition, marked time more faithfully than the chapel bell outside. When he reached the head of the table, he paused and looked at the single glass that remained untouched, its rim still damp with condensation. I noticed it because it should not have been there. No one had sat in that chair during supper. He hesitated, then shrugged and carried it away. But something in the movement unsettled me. The way his eyes lingered, the faint smudge on the linen where a hand might have rested. I remember thinking, absurdly, that even ghosts must follow the seating plan. Outside, the rain had begun again, threading its way down the stained glass, like tears that had learned their manners. I stood by the window and traced the reflection of the candles on the wet flagstones. Oxford does melancholy better than any city I know. Even the puddles look thoughtful. Somewhere beyond the quad, a door closed with the carefulness of guilt. It was then I saw it. A small rectangle of paper, folded once, lying by the lectern. One of the fellows, perhaps, had dropped a note, a reminder of a meeting or a quotation, half remembered. I bent to pick it up. The paper was thick, expensive, and slightly damp at the edges. No address, no signature, just a single word written in dark, deliberate ink. Resurgam. I've never trusted Latin when it appears uninvited. It is the language of epitaphs and examinations, equally skilled at concealing the living. I slipped it into my pocket without quite knowing why. When I stepped out into the quadrangle, the air carried that cold sweetness particular to Oxford rain. The lamps glimmered through the mist, turning every figure into an echo of itself. I passed the porter's lodge, nodded to the man on duty, and heard him mutter something about the dean leaving early. The dean, I remembered, had not attended supper at all. There are moments one only recognizes as beginnings when they have long since ended. That night, the city seemed to be holding its breath, as if waiting for a note that had not yet been played. The sound of my footsteps followed me along St. Swithin's Lane, mingling with the drip of rain from the eaves. At the corner, near the chapel gate, a cat watched me from a dry patch of stone. It blinked slowly, as though considering whether I was worth remembering. I turned once more toward the hall. Through the arched windows, I could still see the steward at work, his movements precise, almost reverent. He reached the far end of the table again, where that untouched glass had stood, and paused. Then, as if noticing something only he could see, he bent closer, wiped the cloth once more, and looked toward the door. When he finally extinguished the last candle, the hall fell into darkness with a sigh that felt almost human. Later, when I thought back on that evening, on the folded note and the empty chair, I realized that every investigation begins not with a question, but with a hesitation, the faint awareness that something, however small, refuses to fit. That was how it started, not with a body or a scream or a confession, but with a glass that should not have been there, and the word resurgam whispering like a prayer to no one in particular. There are men whose smiles are like punctuation, brief, deliberate, and betraying more than they intend. Professor Hewlett was such a man. He had that Oxford trick of appearing both present and elsewhere, as though half his attention was reserved for a footnote he had not yet written. When I first saw him that morning, beneath the dripping arches of St. Swithin's, he was talking to one of the younger dons, his lips forming that peculiar crescent of courtesy that never quite reached the eyes. I remember thinking he smiled twice, once for the world and once for himself. The morning had the dull ache of rain that refused to begin. The cobblestones were slick with indecision, the air restless. I had come to the college to ask about the note. Resurgam, still folded in my coat pocket, its ink faintly bled into the fibers. It had the scent of something written for the dead. The porter, a man whose face looked as though it had been carved from the same wood as the lodge counter, told me that the professor had stayed late in hall after the dinner the night before, long after the fellows had gone. He had been seen leaving near midnight, he said, carrying a small parcel wrapped in brown paper. That was curious, for the only deliveries to the college that day had been books, heavy things bound in dust and optimism. When I reached his rooms, the door was ajar. I knocked, though it felt unnecessary. He looked up from his desk with the mild surprise of a man caught not in wrongdoing but in thought. There was a cup of coffee cooling beside him and a sheaf of notes spread like fallen leaves. He gestured for me to come in. "You are Inspector Morse," he said, not as a question but as a diagnosis. I told him about the note. He listened, his eyes fixed not on me but on the rain gathering in beads upon the window. "Resurgam," he murmured, the word tasting different on his tongue. "We use it on headstones, you know. It's supposed to mean, 'I shall rise again.' A hopeful thought, though not always a true one." I asked if he had attended the supper. He nodded once. There was a pause before he added that he had left early. A headache, he claimed, the kind that presses behind the eyes. But the steward's memory contradicted him, and I made a note of that contradiction, small but insistent, like a splinter beneath the skin. As he spoke, I noticed a crossword folded beneath his papers, half completed in pencil. I glanced at it out of habit. A cross, a word for what returns but is never the same. The answer space held 6 letters. He had written nothing. He caught my glance, smiled again, that second smile, the private one, and turned the page as though to conceal the evidence of thought. There was a book open on his desk, a volume of Milton. A line was underlined with severe precision. "The mind is its own place, and in itself can make a heaven of hell, a hell of heaven." I asked whether he believed that. He shrugged, a small gesture that seemed to weigh more than it should. "We all edit our beliefs to survive," he said. "Some of us are just better at footnotes." When I left his rooms, the air had thickened into drizzle. The porter was still at his post, polishing the same brass plaque as though it contained the secret to eternity. I asked whether the professor often worked late. "Always," he said, "and always alone." As I stepped into the quad, I turned once more toward the staircase. Through the narrow window of his room, I saw him standing motionless, looking down at the folded crossword. Then, slowly, he smiled again. The same restrained curve, twice repeated. I did not yet know what it meant, but it stayed with me. Because there are smiles that conceal affection and others that bury confession. And that morning, under the slow persistence of Oxford rain, I could not tell which one I had seen. There are certain women whose presence alters the light in a room. Not through beauty, which fades under scrutiny, but through quietness, which endures it. Mrs. Dalrymple was such a woman. She worked in the Bodleian's lower stacks, among the bindings that smelt of dust and scholarship, where the world outside became irrelevant and time lost its manners. I remember the first time I saw her, or rather noticed her, because she did not look up when I entered. Most people do. She continued sorting a pile of catalogue cards with the unhurried precision of someone accustomed to being alone. It was raining again that morning, that thin, deliberate rain Oxford reserves for moral instruction. The sky had that worn-out pallor of parchment, and the stones underfoot gleamed like oiled pews. I had gone to the library in pursuit of an absence, a record, or perhaps a misfiled reference, to the word resurgam. It had appeared before, not only on the note from the hall, but in a forgotten sermon I'd found quoted in the college archive. A single word recurring without explanation tends to trouble me more than a confession. She was the one who fetched the volume for me. A fragile edition of 17th-century homilies bound in flaking leather. Her hands were careful but not precious, as though she had long ago made peace with the decay of things meant to last. She placed the book on the desk without comment, then waited. I told her what I was looking for, though I suspect she already knew. The staff in such places often do. They learn to read curiosity like others read weather. When I mentioned the supper in St. Swithin's and the note left behind, her expression changed only slightly. Not surprise, but recognition that something once forgotten had begun to stir. She said she had known Professor Hewlett. Not well, she added quickly, only through the occasional lecture or borrowed reference. He had been researching a set of theological correspondences, letters that no one else seemed to have seen. There was a hesitation before she said that some of those letters had recently gone missing. I asked when. She paused, considering whether to answer or to let the silence perform the work instead. 2 weeks ago, she said at last. The same day, the professor stopped coming to the library. There was, beside her desk, a small vase containing a single iris, its purple deepened by the lack of light. It had begun to wilt from the stem upward, the petals curling like handwriting forgotten mid-sentence. I found myself wondering who had brought it or whether it was for someone gone. She noticed my glance and smiled faintly, that distant kindness reserved for men who ask questions they already regret. As we spoke, she reached to adjust her spectacles, and in that gesture, something slipped from her sleeve. A slip of paper, folded twice. She caught it before it reached the ground, but not before I saw the edge of a word inked in the same deliberate hand as the note I carried. She tucked it into the drawer without comment. I said nothing. One learns that silence, when used correctly, is a form of permission. When I left the library, the bells of St. Mary's were beginning their quarter-hour lament. I stood under the archway and watched the rain gather in the courtyard, thinking of her still at her desk, among the shelves, surrounded by the breathing quiet of books that remember what men forget. It struck me then that certain people exist like footnotes, small, precise, and indispensable to the meaning of the text, though never read aloud. As I crossed the quadrangle, I unfolded my notebook and wrote 3 words: library, iris, sleeve. None of them significant on their own, but together they formed the faint outline of something waiting to be understood. That evening, over a glass of Glenfiddich, I tried to recall her voice. It had the softness of pages turning, and somewhere within it I thought I heard not fear but apology. For what, I could not tell. But I have learned to listen when remorse disguises itself as politeness. It is almost always the prelude to discovery. There is a particular stillness that lives in chapels. Not the quiet of peace, but the suspension of something unresolved. St. Swithin's had that kind of silence. Even the air seemed reluctant to disturb it. The light, thin and filtered through leaded glass, fell like old water on the worn stone. I have never liked entering such places during daylight. Truth, I've found, looks better at dusk. It was early evening when I returned to the chapel. Rain lingered on the cloister windows, a faint percussion marking the rhythm of an hour that refused to end. The verger, an anxious man whose manner suggested perpetual apology, led me toward the choir stalls. He spoke in whispers, as if the dead might overhear us and object. "They found him here this morning," he said. "The fellow, sitting as though in prayer." The body had already been taken away by the time I arrived, but the shape of him remained. In the depression of the cushion, in the faint shadow of moisture where breath had once gathered. Death leaves impressions long after it has finished its work. The verger pointed to a small, open hymnal resting on the ledge. The page was marked not by a ribbon, but by a torn scrap of paper, the edge uneven, the ink blurred. The hymn was "Abide with me," though the words that had been underlined were not the ones you would expect. "When other helpers fail and comforts flee." The line carried a certain irony, though I kept that thought to myself. I asked who the man had been. He hesitated before replying that it was Dr. Layton, a fellow in theology. Retired, but often seen here, sitting alone during the vesper hours. He had been unwell, they said. The vague kind of unwellness Oxford understands perfectly. A quiet unraveling of the mind, camouflaged by routine. I studied the stall where he had sat. There was a faint trace of candle grease on the wood, old wax polished by years of dutiful hands. Beside the hymnal lay a small envelope, unsealed, its corner caught beneath the velvet of the kneeler. Inside was a folded sheet of college stationery, faintly scented with dust and lavender. The writing, careful but weakening, read only, "He said it would rise again." That phrase had already begun to haunt me. Resurgam. It seemed to float between the living and the dead, an unfinished argument with faith. I slipped the note into my pocket. Outside the chapel, I met the porter again. He told me, in the tone of a man half expecting disbelief, that Dr. Layton had dined with Professor Hewlett just 3 nights earlier. They had spoken, apparently, of resurrection. Not in the sermonizing sense, but as though discussing an academic hypothesis. The porter remembered it because he had been polishing the brass candlesticks and overheard the professor say that some things were better left buried. As he spoke, I caught sight of something through the open vestry door, a smudge on the floor where the cleaning had failed to reach. I stepped closer. It was faint but unmistakable. A footprint, thin-soled, likely from a woman's shoe, crossing the chapel toward the choir stalls. The verger, when asked, insisted no woman had been allowed in there that morning. I did not correct him. Oxford has many rules about who is allowed where. Few are obeyed when no one is watching. Back in the nave, the echo of the organ pipes lingered, though no one had played them. I found myself staring up at the carvings, angels worn to anonymity, faces eroded by centuries of damp air. I've always wondered whether devotion and decay are, in essence, the same impulse, the persistence of form despite the failure of meaning. When I left the chapel, the rain had deepened into something steadier, almost companionable. I paused under the archway and looked back. In the half-light, the choir stalls seemed to shift, their dark outlines merging with the shadows of the pillars. I could almost imagine him still sitting there. Dr. Layton, head bowed, lips forming words that would never quite leave the mouth. He said it would rise again. Perhaps he believed it. Perhaps we all do in our different ways. Oxford, after all, is a city built on the hope of resurrection, of ideas, reputations, sins. It is the living who linger here, not the dead. And I, for reasons I never fully understood, lingered too. It is an odd truth that the living forget how to look at death. The first encounter always carries ceremony. The questions asked softly, the hands folded, the respectful pause before one leaves the room. But by the second, the formality fades, replaced by something else. Fatigue, perhaps, or a kind of reluctant intimacy. We no longer stand outside the fact of it. We begin, uncomfortably, to stand within it. The second death came quietly, as such things often do. A caretaker found her, Mrs. Dalrymple, in the reading room of the Bodleian, sometime after dusk. The library had long emptied, the lamps left burning low for the night staff. She was seated upright in a chair, her head tilted slightly, as if she had been listening to someone just out of sight. The police doctor said her heart had failed. A delicate phrase as though it had merely withdrawn permission. I was there not long after. The scent of paper hung close and heavy, touched faintly by lavender. Her desk was tidy, unbearably so, each pencil sharpened, each note stacked with geometric care. But the book before her was what held me. It was open to the same page I had seen her handle days earlier, the 17th century sermons, brittle as confession itself. Beneath one passage, a new mark, a faint stroke of graphite under the words, "The body is not the soul's end, but its rehearsal." I stood a long while over that line. It seemed too deliberate for coincidence, too delicate for message. I remembered the note in her sleeve, the word folded like an unanswered prayer. Resurgam. The librarian who had found her spoke in half whispers. She said Mrs. Dalrymple had come in earlier than usual that day. She had been seen speaking to Professor Hewlett near the archives. An exchange brief but intense, their faces too still for politeness. The librarian noticed how the professor had not returned his library key that evening. I filed it away, a small untidy corner in the day's ledger. Later, in the small office adjoining the reading room, I looked through her belongings. A handbag, a set of keys, and a single letter, unsealed, addressed to no one. Inside was a page torn from a crossword book, every clue solved but one. 5 letters, that which follows resurrection. The space was blank. Strange, how language itself seems to conspire at times. Death speaking to death through riddles. But I could not shake the feeling that she had left the clue unfinished on purpose. Some people cannot bear to write the final word. I left the library just as the rain began again. The city was half drowned in it, lights bleeding into the cobbles. The porter at St. Swethin's met me by the gate. He had heard, of course. News travels quickly in places that thrive on silence. He asked if it was true she had died at her post. I said yes, though even as I spoke, I wasn't sure if that was the right word. Some people do not die so much as recede, like the sound of a bell after the last chime. I walked to the chapel without meaning to. The air inside was thick with candle smoke. The verger had left the choir stalls open, the cushions still damp from the morning's service. I sat where Dr. Layton had been found. It seemed only polite to give the dead their symmetry. The same hymnal lay nearby, though the page had been changed. This time it was lead kindly light. My eyes caught the line beneath the verse. A faint indentation, as if someone had pressed a pencil there long ago. It was the same hand, I was sure of it. He said it would rise again. 2 deaths now, linked not by cause but by echo. A professor, a fellow, a librarian, all bound by the same quiet word. Somewhere in their symmetry lay a truth still refusing its own shape. When I stepped back into the rain, the bells were tolling from Magdalen Tower, each note spaced just far enough apart to make you wonder if the next would come. And as I walked through the quadrangle, the word returned once more, unbidden, patient as guilt. Resurgam, I shall rise again. But whose promise was it, I wondered? God's or man's? There are moments when even the smallest detail refuses to behave as it should. That evening it was the ink, black, ordinary, unremarkable. And yet it would not dry. It bled across the paper like a thought one could not quite restrain, a word unwilling to be fixed. I remember standing by the open window of my flat on North Parade, the rain having paused long enough to allow the city its breath. The note lay before me, taken from Mrs. Dalrymple's desk, its edges beginning to curl in the lamplight. Resurgam once more, though this time written with a trembling hand, the line beneath it still wet when I had found it. I had been turning over the events of the week in my mind, the way one shuffles a deck already stacked against him. The professor, the fellow, the librarian, 3 lives orbiting the same word. It struck me as less a clue than a refrain, as though someone, somewhere, were conducting a private requiem to which I had not been invited. The case, such as it was, had begun to thicken around me like Oxford fog, heavy, opaque, and quietly resistant to reason. Strange how knowledge, in this city, behaves like guilt, accumulating in corners, disguised as scholarship until it begins to stain. Lewis had left earlier that evening, muttering about supper and sanity. He had suggested that perhaps I ought to do the same, but I had no appetite for either. Instead, I poured another measure of whiskey, the good one, and watched the ink spread faintly across the fibers. The smell of it, metallic and faintly sweet, reminded me of school days, of letters begun and never sent. It was then I noticed something peculiar. Beneath the main inscription, faintly visible under the lamplight, were other words, erased but not quite gone. The paper had been pressed too hard, the indentations remaining like the echo of a confession. I fetched a pencil and shaded lightly across the surface. Slowly, like a face emerging from water, the letters appeared. Psalm 130. I recited it from memory. Out of the depths have I cried unto thee, O Lord. There was something almost indecent about finding faith in evidence. Still, it gave the word a new dimension. Resurrection, not of flesh perhaps, but of guilt. The following morning, I went to St. Swithin's early. The porter, looking as though sleep had been a luxury long denied him, mentioned that Professor Hewlett had not been seen since Thursday. His rooms were locked, his curtains drawn. He added, almost as an afterthought, that a faint smell of turpentine had been noticed in the stairwell. I found that curious. There are few reasons for turpentine in a theologian's lodging, none of them innocent. When the locksmith forced the door, the air that escaped was stale with ink and solitude. The desk was covered in drafts. Sermons, perhaps, or defenses. Each page layered upon the next, all written in the same unsteady script. But it was the topmost sheet that held me. The ink was still glistening, still wet, though the window stood open and the air was dry. It was as though he had written the word and disappeared before it could settle. Across the page, Resurgam. Beneath it, again, the reference to Psalm 130, and beside it, a single word newly added. Forgive. I do not believe in coincidence, though I have often been forced to work alongside it. Yet as I stood there, the sound of the rain beginning again against the panes, I could not escape the sense that the city itself was participating in this act of concealment. Oxford does not destroy its secrets. It preserves them under glass, labels them in Latin, and calls the process scholarship. I closed the window, extinguished the lamp, and pocketed the note. The ink smeared faintly against my thumb, refusing to dry even then. Some truths, I suppose, are not meant to set. When I stepped back into the corridor, the porter looked up at me, waiting for something I could not give him. I told him only that it was raining again, which in Oxford is explanation enough for almost anything. It was meant to be a small thing, a supper among colleagues, the sort of evening where the conversation floats politely above the wine-like mist over the Cherwell. I had accepted the invitation out of habit rather than anticipation. There is a peculiar loneliness in the ritual of academic dinners, the same laughter, the same thin compliments, the same sense that everyone is rehearsing civility while thinking of something else. Yet that evening, the empty chair did all the speaking. The table had been laid for 7, though only 6 of us arrived. Hewlett's name card stood at his place like an accusation. The candles had been lit, the soup poured, and still no sound of his careful, dragging gait in the corridor. Someone remarked that perhaps he had lost track of time in his rooms. Another suggested illness, delicately. the kind of word that hovers between concern and relief. I said nothing. I had seen his door the previous morning, still locked, his windows dark against the drizzle. The dean insisted we begin, and so we did. The meal progressed in its quiet rhythm, silver against porcelain, the soft spill of wine. Yet each time the door creaked, every head turned, expectant, rehearsing the same gesture of welcome. None of them could say why they expected him at all. Men like Hewlett are rarely missed until they are required to defend themselves. I watched the steward refill the glasses. His hands were steady, but his eyes betrayed him. He glanced more than once toward the empty chair, as though remembering something he ought to forget. It was then I noticed it. A faint trace of wax on the linen before the absent place setting. A candle had once been there, melted and removed. An insignificant detail, perhaps, but absence has a way of leaving its own residue. During the second course, the dean began a story about Hewlett's time as a young lecturer, his pedantry, his fondness for quoting Milton in conversation. It was told with the affectionate irony scholars reserve for the dead, or nearly so. But when one of the younger fellows interrupted to say that the professor had recently been seen in the chapel after hours, murmuring what sounded like Latin prayers, the table fell into a silence that no amount of claret could soften. Someone tried to laugh it off, but the sound faltered before it reached the end of the sentence. Dessert arrived, pears poached in port, glistening like regret. Outside, the rain had resumed, tapping the mullioned glass with the light insistence of thought. I asked the steward quietly whether he had prepared a meal for the missing guest. He hesitated before nodding. "Yes, sir. It was taken upstairs yesterday evening. I asked if it had been returned." Another pause. "No, sir. Not yet. Later, when the others drifted away, a few to the common room, most to their own excuses, I lingered, as I always do." The candles had begun to gutter, their flames bowing under the weight of their own smoke. The table, stripped of voices, looked almost reverent. I found myself staring again at that one empty chair, the folded napkin, the untouched glass. There is a point at which waiting turns into mourning, though one seldom recognizes the transition. I thought then of the note found in the chapel, of the word resurgam, and of the strange persistence of the ink that would not dry. Oxford has a way of rehearsing its tragedies long before anyone notices the script. As I rose to leave, I saw that someone had placed a small envelope beneath the professor's name card. It bore no address, only a single word scrawled in the same wavering hand I had come to know too well. "Forgive." I did not open it. Some messages are not meant for the living. I folded it carefully and slipped it into my pocket, feeling the faint weight of it against my coat, another piece of the pattern I could almost see but not yet name. Outside, the rain had grown steadier, soaking the flagstones until they gleamed like glass. The lamps along St. Swithin's Lane flickered uncertainly, their reflections doubling in the puddles. I remember thinking, as I lit a cigarette beneath the arch, that the dinner guest who never came had managed, in his absence, to fill the entire evening. And perhaps, I thought, he had always intended to. I remember the day the light changed. It was neither dawn nor dusk, but that dull, directionless hour when Oxford loses its edges, and even the stone seems to withdraw into itself. I had been walking along Parks Road, the rain still undecided, when a message reached me from the college librarian. "A small discovery," she said, "in the special collections. Something I might wish to see." The note carried no urgency, but curiosity has always been my most incurable vice. I went at once. The reading room was almost deserted. The students had retreated for the vacation, leaving behind that particular stillness of absence, a silence that feels almost watchful. Mrs. Pelham, the deputy librarian, met me by the glass display cases near the north wall. She was a pale, earnest woman whose voice always seemed to belong to a smaller room. She said a visitor had requested access to a recently restored manuscript, a devotional miscellany from the early 17th century. It had been displayed only briefly before being withdrawn. When I asked why, she gestured toward the glass case. There, beneath the careful glare of the preservation lights, lay the open folio. The ink, brown with age, looked more like shadow than script. But in the margin, newly visible after the restoration, someone had added a few lines in a darker hand. A later intrusion, unmistakably deliberate. She leaned closer, as if confiding to the parchment itself. "It isn't in Latin," she said. I bent to read. The words, faint but legible, were English. A short verse, 8 lines, each one a careful wound. "When dust remembers dust and words unmake their sound, the faithful will rise, though faith is never found." I read it twice. The handwriting was familiar. Precise, angular, too modern for the manuscript. I had seen it before, in the notes on Hewlett's desk, in the trembling letters on the library card, and on that single word that refused to fade. Resurgam. Mrs. Pelham said the discovery had been made by one of her assistants, who noticed the marginalia only that morning. I asked if anyone else had seen it. "Just one," she said. The assistant herself, a young woman recently employed, though now absent without explanation. Her name escaped her for a moment before surfacing with a frown. Dalrymple. There was a faint crack in the glass of the display case, a hairline fracture running from the lower corner like a vein under skin. I traced it absently with a fingertip. The glass had been replaced only last month, the librarian said, after some minor mishap with humidity control. But as she spoke, I noticed something else. Inside the case, resting beneath the folio, was a folded slip of paper, smaller, modern, and clearly out of place. I asked that it be removed under supervision. The archivist obeyed, sliding her gloves on with the solemnity of a ritual. The note was written in the same dark ink as the poem, the pen having blotted once at the start of a line. 4 words only, though they seemed to fill the room. He promised to return. I thanked her, though she could not have known for what. Later, sitting in the cloisters with a cigarette that refused to stay lit, I tried to recall where I had seen that same phrasing. Somewhere in the chapel records, perhaps, or one of Leighton's annotated sermons. But no, it was earlier. On the torn edge of a page recovered from the professor's study, half erased, the remaining letters spelling turn. What had seemed a fragment now began to realign itself, quietly, insistently. It is one thing to chase meaning, another to be chased by it. That night, I placed the poem on my desk and read it once more by lamplight. The ink had faded almost to invisibility, yet in the reflection on the glass frame, I thought I saw movement, the faint shimmer of moisture, as though the words themselves were weeping through the centuries. I left the lamp burning until dawn, though I could not tell you why. Some documents I have learned are not meant to be read, but remembered. And memory, like ink, resists drying when it most needs to fade. It was late afternoon when the rain began to fall sideways against the windows of the Sheldonian. I remember thinking how Oxford's weather always seemed to know more than its citizens. It arrived preemptively, as though warning of consequences not yet understood. The hall was nearly empty by then, save for the echo of chairs being folded and the hollow acoustics of a conversation already over. The lecture had been scheduled for 4 o'clock. The topic, obscure even by Oxford's forgiving standards, concerned moral resurrection in 17th century theology. The guest speaker had been, once again, Professor Hewlett. He had accepted the invitation 2 months earlier. His absence, however, had gone unremarked until the first slide appeared on the screen, and there was no one to explain it. What followed was both awkward and revealing. The dean suggested postponement. The fellows murmured their agreement with the polite reluctance of men grateful for reprieve. But someone, I can't recall who, suggested the lecture might proceed anyway. The projector was already running, the notes had been sent ahead, and in Oxford, even absence can be made to sound instructive. So they began to read the professor's words aloud, one slide at a time, as though he were dictating from another room. His handwriting, projected in light across the wooden panels, looked uneven. Some lines bold, others faint, as if written during tremors of indecision. I sat at the back, listening. Each phrase struck me not as academic argument, but confession. The soul, when parted from reason, becomes a mirror. It reflects but cannot see. It was the second slide that caught me. The handwriting shifted, slightly sharper, the ink darker. The margins contained annotations not intended for an audience. Fragments, questions, single words repeated as though rehearsed for memory. One stood alone at the bottom corner. Resurgam. I had begun to see that word, not as symbol, but as contagion. It had infected the paper, the sermons, the library catalogue, now even the walls of the Sheldonian. It was everywhere and nowhere, like the trace of a dream that refused to dissolve upon waking. At the sixth slide, the hall lights dimmed abruptly, and the sound of the rain grew louder. Nearer. The caretaker moved to the control panel, muttering about faulty wiring. For a moment the screen went blank, then flickered again. But the image had changed. No longer the professor's notes, but a scanned page from the manuscript I had seen in the Bodleian. The poem in the margin, the same dark lines I'd read behind glass. Only this time there was something new. A faint watermark across the verse, a library stamp blurred by moisture. And through that blur, just legible, the name Leighton. The hall emptied soon after, under the pretense of technical difficulty. Yet I remained. There was something deliberate in that glitch. Too deliberate. Someone had inserted the image into the lecture file after the notes were sent. I knew the kind of mind capable of such precision. It was not accident. It was a message. As the caretaker moved among the rows, locking the folding seats, I asked who had operated the projector earlier. He paused, thought, then said the name as if uncertain it mattered. Mrs. Dalrymple. She had volunteered. Outside, the rain had gathered into sheets, sliding from the gutters like exhausted memory. I stood beneath the portico, listening to the slow rhythm of the drops on the flagstones. The streets were empty, the city half vanished behind a veil of water. In the distance, the bell of St. Mary's tolled 6, each note dissolving into the next, like a question without answer. When I returned to my flat, I found the envelope waiting on the step, unmarked, damp and heavy with the scent of ink. Inside, folded once, was a single page of lecture paper. The top corner bore Hewlett's initials. Below, in that same slanted hand, "If I do not appear, begin at the end." I read it twice, then turned it over. On the reverse, faintly visible through the paper, another line bled through from the ink. Words written, perhaps in haste, perhaps in ceremony, out of the depths. I left the letter on my desk, poured a whiskey, and sat in the quiet, listening to the rain resume its patient catechism against the glass. Somewhere between the words and their echo, I began to understand that the lecture had not been cancelled at all. It had merely been delivered, backwards. There are evenings that never quite end. They lie dormant beneath the others, preserved like pressed leaves between the pages of memory. The night of the tutorial supper was one such evening. Even now I can still see the hall, the long table laid like a wound of light in the dark, and the glass that should not have been there, the first tremor in a pattern that would not rest. I returned there weeks later, though there was no reason to. The college porter had unlocked the side door without question, habit perhaps, or pity. He seemed to understand that certain places must be faced again if only to confirm that they still exist. The hall smelled faintly of polish and disuse. Chairs stood pushed under the tables with military obedience. The candlesticks had been removed, but on the oak surface I could still see the faint circular stain where wax had melted and been wiped away. The chair at the far end, Hewlett's, had been replaced, or so they said. The new one gleamed more darkly, its sheen almost defiant. Yet as I stood before it, I could still feel the weight of the old one, the slow erosion of its arms where thought and hesitation had left their mark. I poured myself a small whiskey from the flask I had brought, not as indulgence, but as ceremony. It was there, after all, that the case had begun, or at least, where it had, begun to show its face. Hewlett's glass, the untouched seat, the note with its obstinate word. Resurgam. It had travelled through every layer of the investigation like a recurring phrase in a requiem. Sitting alone now, I unfolded my notebook, its pages swollen from rain. The ink had bled in places, blurring certain words into others. Resurgam had merged with return. I wondered if it was correction or confession. The sound of the rain outside began to thread itself into the silence, a rhythm too precise to ignore. It struck me then that all the deaths, Leighton's, Dalrymple's, the professor's probable one, had occurred after rain. Not a storm, never thunder, just the same insistent drizzle, thin as gilt. In the corner of the hall stood a small cabinet of silverware, its glass front clouded with dust. I had seen it countless times, but had never looked closely. This time I did. Among the trophies and forgotten decanters, I noticed a folded paper pressed behind one of the trays, a slip no larger than a bookmark. I removed it carefully, expecting inventory notes or a cleaner's list. Instead, it was a fragment of a hymn, written in a hurried hand. Lead, kindly light, amid the encircling gloom. Beneath it, in smaller script, a line I'd come to recognize as Hewlett's. I'm not lost, I'm delayed. I cannot say whether I felt sorrow or admiration. There was something unbearably human in the attempt, to rewrite one's absence as mere postponement. From the high windows, the sound of water reached me again, not from rain this time, but from the gutters outside, overflowing in slow cascades. I stood and walked toward the dais. The table, though empty, seemed to hold the weight of memory. I noticed, near the head, the faintest indentation in the wood. A groove cut not by accident, but by repetition, the edge of a knife drawn absent-mindedly in thought. I ran my finger along it, and a fragment of deduction surfaced, small but stubborn. The indentation curved to form an arc, not random but deliberate. Half of a circle, like the bottom of a letter. The same radius, I realized, as the seal pressed into the note I still carried. That detail, meaningless on its own, connected itself quietly to something else. The broken glass pane in the Bodleian display, the curve of the watermark over the verse, each fragment carrying the same geometry, the same insistence on recurrence, the circle that will not close. I left the hall without switching off the lights. Some rooms, I've learned, demand illumination even when no one is watching. Outside, Oxford lay drenched and deserted, the lamplight glancing off puddles that reflected nothing in particular. As I crossed St. Swethin's Lane, I thought of that line again. I'm not lost. I'm delayed. A claim, perhaps, or a warning. In this city, the dead are never punctual. They wait for us, quietly, until we return to listen. And on nights like this, with the rain against the glass and the scent of candle wax still in the air, I sometimes think they almost speak. There are sounds that do not belong to the present. The bells of St. Swithin's are among them. They toll with a patience that mocks the living. Slow, deliberate, untouched by urgency. I heard them first that evening from my rooms, the notes drifting through the mist like the breath of some reluctant confession. It had been months since they'd rung at all. They were supposed to ring only for celebration or death, and lately Oxford had little appetite for either. I remember the air that night, damp, undecided, with the faint taste of smoke from the canal. I had been sitting at my desk, the papers of the case spread before me like an untranslatable text. Hewlett's handwriting stared back, the same half-slanted, uncertain hand that had threaded through the whole affair. Resurgam. The word had grown heavy by then, too full of echoes to mean only what it claimed. Lewis had gone home. He had said gently that I looked tired. He was right, though it was not fatigue of the body. I poured myself a measure of whiskey, more ritual than comfort, and listened as the bells continued their measured speech. 7 strokes, then silence, then 8. Not the usual rhythm. I counted again. It was the pattern of the Angelus, but misaligned, as if rung by someone remembering rather than following the rule. I went out into the quadrangle. The rain had returned, thin and hesitant, turning the paving stones to glass. Across the courtyard, the chapel windows glowed faintly. The door stood ajar. That small disobedience was enough. I stepped inside. The air smelled of wax and stone dust, and something else. Ink, perhaps, faintly metallic, as if the place itself had absorbed it. The choir stalls were empty, the hymnals stacked, the pulpit draped with its familiar brocade. But at the base of the lectern, I saw a single sheet of paper, folded and left as if placed there for someone expected later. I picked it up. It was another verse, written in that same hand I could have recognized blindfolded. When the bell forgets its reason, the silence will resume the prayer. Beneath it, the initials H.H. Hewlett's. The organ pipes creaked as the wind moved through them, a sound too human to ignore. And then, faintly, above the whisper of rain, came footsteps. Slow, measured, deliberate, the same tempo as the bells. I turned toward the chancel. A figure stood in the doorway to the vestry, half-shadowed, coat damp at the shoulders. The verger. Or so I thought. He said the bells had rung themselves. It was not possible, he added, though he did not sound convinced. I asked who had last wound the mechanism. He frowned. A week ago, perhaps more. He had heard no one tonight, no sound of the bell rope. But as he spoke, I noticed something on his cuff. A faint smudge of ink, black, still fresh. He saw me notice. He lifted his hand as if to wipe it away, then stopped. "It's the same ink we use for the memorial register," he said. I'd been updating the names. He smiled, a small, tired movement of the mouth. "There were 2 new entries this week," he added, almost as an afterthought. Dalrymple. Leighton. I left soon after, though not without glancing once more at the bells above. Invisible in the tower, yet heavy in their unseen motion. Outside, the rain had stopped. The air was unnaturally still, as though waiting for a cue it knew would not come. Back in my rooms, I placed the note beside the others. The table had become a kind of altar by then, each fragment of paper a relic of the inexplicable. I looked again at Hewlett's final line, "When the bell forgets its reason," and felt something uncoil, quietly, within the pattern. It was not a message to the living, but a reply to the dead. A reminder, perhaps, that some prayers are answered only by echo. The bells did not ring again that night, but long after I had turned out the light, I thought I heard their resonance still. Not in the air, but somewhere deeper, like memory striking its own hour. And in that hollow sound, I finally understood why the word resurgam had never seemed to fade. It was never meant as hope, it was simply persistence. The dead refusing to be forgotten.